While I was working offline, I noticed that the UVs that we created before, there are too many pieces. So the texel density of each part was going to be too minimal. So the detail was not going to come through how I want it. So in this video, what I'm intend to do is fix those UVs and divide the material in two. So we're going to have two sets of UVs for all the assets. That way, the detail on some of the assets will come out better. Let's get started. So my objective here is to divide the UV sheet into two parts. One with all the walls and the big assets, and then another sheet with all the small ones. Right now, I'm selecting all the small parts so that I can visualize how I'm going to lay out the UVs for the little parts. So what I'm gonna be doing is scaling some of the UV shells and increasing the size of others so that the detail can come out better. So all I'm doing here is just selecting, scaling, and rotating parts, and using the same tools that we have used on the previous videos. I am grabbing also all the shells that look similar and then stacking them. That way I can maximize my UV sheet. We're just using rotation and the stacking tools. Here I'm using the strain UVs, but sometimes it gets a little bit buggy. So all I want to do is I just press Ctrl Z to revert and then bring it back. If it's mostly straight, then I leave it how it is. For the logs, they don't require a lot of space, so I'm putting them apart so that I can see all the other parts. And now I can see all the logs in one space. And I'm clicking unfold just to make sure they are unfolded properly. And then I'm selecting the other parts to see the whole picture of how my UV sheet is going to be laid out. I'm including the chimney on this one. So in the other sheet, I'm just going to include the two walls, the log walls, and the ceiling and the roof. For the chimney, I increase the texel density by increasing the size. I rotate them all for the same rotation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack them. That way, when I bring it into Substance, I can apply a texture on it, and it's going to be duplicated all across all four sides. The reason I don't stack these two is because when you have parts that are on opposite side, then you have to flip them, and that causes problems. So I don't like to do that. Here's the post. I unfold just to make sure it's unfolded properly. And then I move parts out of the way. Here I grab the texel density of the chimney and apply it to the top part of the chimney. That way they are all the same texel density. And I start rearranging all the UV shells. And on these strips that I see that they can be straight, I'll select them and then make them straighter with the straighten UV option. And you can see I'm rearranging everything so that everything is inside the 0 to 1 space. There I saw that it was gonna pass the 0 to 1 space, so I moved that out of the way. As long as this doesn't pass the 0 to 1 space, we're fine, because then if you pass the 0 to 1 space, the texture is going to repeat. So I don't want that. So I'm trying to keep it inside the 0 to 1 space on the UV sheet. And I don't want no overlapping UVs, except the ones I'm stacking. And this all comes in hand when you bake. When you bake things that are stacked, you get errors. But if you're stacking objects that have the same detail on each face, it doesn't really matter, because you're going to bake and it's the same detail all across. But since we're not doing a lot of detail on none of these, it's fine to stack most of them. Now these two, the arc, I can stack them because one side you can see, the other one you can't. So it really doesn't matter if you stack them. And these two, I couldn't figure out why they were not aligning, and it's because the one of the faces has extra faces around. Then I figured it out, and then I just stacked them on top. Those faces you're not gonna see. So now I'm rearranging everything so that everything looks the same. And maximizing my UV sheet. Keep rearranging stuff around, trying to maximize my space. That way I can get more detail through. I can increase the size on some of the parts since I'm seeing that I still have more space to work with. So I'll move that out of the way because I want the door bigger. And all I'm doing is just increasing the size of some of the UV spaces, of some of the UV sheets, and moving them around. And rearranging. That's all it is. Move it out of the way. Scale, rotate, and move. That's all the tools I'm using. And all these tools we have used before. So it's just practicing. So this is mostly like playing Tetris. Just making things fit, that they do not overlap. Now that my sheet is done, now I'll give the final check. And that's one of my sheets. Now what I'll do is I'll assign another material to those pieces so that in Substance it becomes another texture set. I'll select all the parts. And just assign the other material. And now I'll start working on the walls for the second sheet. And I'll, since I'm already in the hypershade, I'll assign the other material to the other assets so that I can start UVing. I'll save my scene. And the reason I saved is because Maya likes to crash a lot. So now I'm checking what's the top part of my wall, because now when I apply the texture, I don't want my textures to be rotated. So now what I'm doing with the logs is I'm selecting all the logs, and then I'm going to check the texture density on them, and then check which is the top log and which is the bottom log. That way I don't stack those two, but I'll stack every other log in the middle. And I'll do the same thing with the larger logs. Then all the rest I'll stack. That way when I bake, the bake comes out clean, at least the top and the bottom. And all the faces from the edge, I'll just stack all of them together, because that way all the ends look the same. I'll rotate the roof and make them and position them in the same direction and stack them and try to align them a little bit. And then one of the sheets is going to be larger than the other, because the other one is the top and one is the bottom. So now I stack them, and that looks fine. I double check to see if they are unfolded. And I click on an unfold on the other one as well, just to double check. Now I'll get the texel density of one face and apply it to the next one. Then I'll increase it on size. And then I'll just stack them. And all I'm doing is I'm stacking them because I want the maximum texel density for each of my UV sheets. Now I start rearranging them. And I'll select the other two so that I can see where are they located and start rearranging them. I'll increase them in size. And see if I can find more space for them. Same thing with the larger logs. Then I get the texel density for the little ones and apply it to the larger ones. That way the two logs have the same texel density since they're going to be next to each other. And then move the rest. Just making space for the UVs. And now select everything, double check that everything is fine. Grab the whole thing, export. Look for the location and export the file. And now all I have to do is import it into Substance and start working on it since I already made my UVs. And all I did was I used some of the tools to make all the edges soft. So all I did was I selected the mesh, and there's an option, how I said before, soft edge. So I selected all of the edges or just the mesh and applied a soft edge to it. That way when it bakes correctly. I duplicated my exploded view, and what I'm going to do on this instance is create a high mesh. And all I did for the high mesh is duplicate the group, hide the original group, and then renamed it to high poly, and selected all the edges that I said that I wanted more detail in, and applied a bevel. That's about it. That way, when you bake your textures on Substance, you get these nice bevel effects on your edges. See how I'm just selecting and smooth edge, and then if you see a lot of distortion, you go into mesh display and press set faces, and it'll pop back, and then you put another smooth on it. See, set faces and then soft edge. Then I select the edges and apply a bevel. And it's just a small amount of bevel. And I'm going to do this with every single mesh. And that's in the high poly group, because I want those details to come through. I'll select the front faces for this mesh because these are bricks or stones, and then I'll just extrude. I'll extrude all of them. I'll turn off keep faces together so that all the extrusions are separated, and then I just play with the thickness and the offset to make them in, and that creates the illusion that there's blocks in each of those faces. And this is for the high poly. I also exported this file as a FBX. So if you're not comfortable doing the high poly, then you can use mine. The only thing is that the high poly has to be in the same position as your low poly. So if you want to use my file, all you have to do is align all your meshes with mine in my high poly mesh, and that's it. And then export that and bake on top of mine, and all my detail is gonna come into yours. And this process might be a little bit confusing for beginners, but this is standard. This is what we in the industry use. We always create a high poly, then create a low poly out of our high poly, and then bake the detail on the low poly. That way you can use it in games. And here is the same procedure as I did with the others. It's just selecting all the edges that I want bevel and using the bevel tool, and that's it. And I'll decrease the bevel because for the most, every time you use a bevel, the bevel comes out really big. So you need to adjust it to your liking. I'm double checking that the bevels are correct. And that edge, which is hard, I'm gonna make it a soft edge. And all I'm using is the same tool, shift right click, bevel, shift right click, smooth edge. And you can see now you don't have that hard edge, and it looks soft. It looks rounded. I'm double checking all my meshes. And the high poly meshes do not need UVs. The UVs are there because we created it before with the low polys. This, after you're adding more detail to your mesh, it doesn't need a UV sheet, because what you're doing is you're grabbing a high poly mesh and grabbing all the detail from the high poly mesh and applying it to the low poly mesh, and that's all it is. So the high poly never doesn't need UVs whatsoever. So here I'm just selecting edges and bevel. Shift right click, bevel. Same thing as this one. Select all the edges that I want beveled. And applying a bevel. That's it. Nothing special here. Double checking if the bevel is too big, but it's perfect. So I'll move on. And soft edge. And I'll do the same thing with the logs. The logs is easier. I select everything and just bevel. And just reduce the amount of beveling. And the reason I did a voiceover instead of just going step by step is because we've used all these tools before. So it's just a matter of putting them in practice. And that's it. Now we export. We name the FBX underscore high poly HP and export. And we are done.